Hello and welcome back to another episode of Blurble Reasoning. Today we are talking about the first Gotrek and Felix novel, Trollslayer, which takes place in the old Warhammer Fantasy universe. I never know whether to call it Warhammer Fantasy, or the old world, or the world that was, or whatever. I'm still figuring out the terminology for that because, of course, nowadays if you want fantasy-flavoured Warhammer, the modern stuff is Age of Sigmar. But that's a whole kettle of fish that we don't necessarily need to dive into today. I'm really excited to talk about this book, in case you couldn't tell, because I have so many thoughts on it. But first of all, I want to tell you how I got here, and there's kind of two roads that converged to kind of get me on this path. First of all, the more common road, I suppose, is I have some friends who are really into Warhammer, both 40k and Age of Sigmar / Warhammer Fantasy before it, and having been friends with them for so long and following them on social media and watching them paint miniatures and stuff, I'm talking about you, Ryan, if you're listening, you're cool as heck. In fact, you know what, go follow Sir Shaw on Instagram, I will leave a link to his profile down below. But yeah, years of kind of like background radiation of hearing about Warhammer and seeing it and stuff has naturally bred an interest in me. But here's the thing, I'm not a war gamer. I'm not really interested in I guess, is it a tabletop game? Would you classify it as that? And I'm not also really able to afford the miniatures, or I don't have the steady hands with which to paint them. You know, I'd like to try one day. I've heard that there's workarounds, but all the same, when I look at miniature painting, I just think there's no way I'm going to be able to do that. But that doesn't stop me from being interested in the universe and the characters and the lore, the little scraps of lore I've been picking up on over the years. It seems like the kind of universe I want to see, and that brings me to the second origin of my interest. About a decade ago, my sister lent me a book called The Vampire Genevieve, which at the time I didn't realise was an omnibus of novels and novellas, I think, within the Warhammer Fantasy universe centred around this character, the Vampire Genevieve. If you haven't seen it before, it's this great big, like 900 or something page book, surely a progenitor of things to come for me in that department. And I really enjoyed my time with it. I have, of course, since learned that the Vampire Genevieve stories are some of the highest regarded in the Warhammer Fantasy universe. But do you ever read something or play something that just stays in the back of your head for years? Like, for me, for video games, that was Dragon Quest. I played a bit of Dragon Quest 9 and it stayed in the back of my head of, I really want to play another game like that. Turns out there were at least 8 more of those, so that was fine. The Vampire Genevieve was the same thing. The world in which the tales took place stayed in the back of my mind. I just really liked it, and I really liked this idea of telling a series of stories about a single character within this larger fantasy world, which has the potential for many, many more stories to be told within it. If I'm being honest, I think that interest, that desire to find a world like that, a connected world like that, probably comes from my time with World of Warcraft. I've been playing that game since Mists of Pandaria. I've played every expansion since, and anyone will be able to tell you that the quality of the narrative fluctuates a lot within World of Warcraft, but no matter how bad things have gotten, I've always been interested in the lore of that world. And, you know, I've been kind of like warned off of some of these Warhammer books because of, you know, they're written to sell miniatures, they're written to sell people on the war games and stuff like that. They're not necessarily the best books and stories in their own right, which is something we're going to talk about a lot today. But as much as I am reading it hoping for a good fantasy story, I'm also reading it to learn about the lore and to immerse myself in this world. So that has been a lot of preamble about me and my history with Warhammer. It was inevitable and necessary, but I will finally now get to talking about Trollslayer. For those of you who don't know the selling pitch for Trollslayer, or for the Gotrek and Felix novels, basically a dwarf who is in exile and has sworn a quest to find a heroic death for crimes he committed in the past, is accompanied by a man named Felix whose life was saved by Gotrek and who has sworn to follow him and record his travels in an epic poem. Throughout the way, while just seeking danger and adventure, they accidentally end up becoming heroes and thwarting the forces of chaos. That's the pitch. And before I start talking about spoilers, one last thing. It is important to note that the very first book, Trollslayer, I was warned as well, is kind of a compilation of a bunch of shorter stories, not short stories, but shorter stories, which appeared in the White Dwarf magazines of the past. So Trollslayer comes off less like a single novel and more like... it's more like, you know, when you start watching an anime, or it doesn't have to be an anime, it can be any show, and it's kind of like... they're setting up the premise of the characters and the world before they really get to a big overarching story. Think Bleach. Think Bleach's first 15 or so episodes. It's a little bit like that, which I did not hate, but there are some people I've seen, because I've done my research on these books, there are some people who recommend starting with Skaven Slayer. I don't know how good or bad of an idea that is, because I haven't read Skaven Slayer yet, but, you know, it's just worth knowing that going into it. So, Trollslayer. What did I think about this damn book now that we're 5 minutes into this video? I had a really good time with this book. I really enjoyed myself with this book. I was warned off of Warhammer novels for, you know, reasons like like I already said, about them trying to sell you on a larger universe and other products and stuff like that, and because of that, despite the Gotrek and Felix novels being some of the best regarded within the universe, they are still going to be lacking that, not necessarily originality, but lacking that kind of, I don't know, complexity, gravitas, that honestly just might be more of a tone thing in general. But trust me, as someone who has been reading very heavy, very long series, to be fair, Gotrek and Felix is also a very long series, but you know, I'm coming off the back of reading Wheel of Time, of reading, I would say, the first half of Lord of the Rings. I decided to put that on hold for various reasons. I'm currently reading through the Sun Eater series. I've been reading through the Live Ship Traders trilogy by Robin Hobb. In comparison to those, Trollslayer is a lot more pulpy. I don't know if it really earns the term pulp in its entirety, and the word pulp does also come with negative associations, so let me just be clear. I was looking for something more pulpy. I was looking for something that was easy, quick, and satisfying. I have equated this book in conversations with friends to the fast food of fantasy, and that's not an insult, because fast food is delicious for a reason. It's just not very nutritious, which I guess could also apply to this metaphor. It's also not without heart, I guess. When reading this book, knowing I was going into something easier, quicker, and more pulpy to read, I was thinking to myself, or I guess I was looking out for, does this still ring true? And by that what I mean is, you know, when you read a book, and it doesn't matter what genre of book, but there will just be the occasional line that sticks out to you as truthful to the human experience. Doesn't matter what themes it's exploring, it could be a grimdark book, it could be a comedy, but do the words ring true with you as part of a human experience? Or I guess in other words, does it feel like this is a tale that somebody had in their heart to tell you outside of contractual obligation? You know, that's kind of why I was thinking about this, because this is a type of franchise fiction, I would argue. And I'm happy to report that, yes, I do believe that to be the case. There were several moments in this book when I went, yeah, like, I can see where he's coming from, or I can resonate with what the character is feeling right now. It might be a bit more of a truncated tale, especially with Trollslayer, I'm sure, compared to other books, being a collection of shorter stories. Like, the one thing I would put out there is, you know, compared to the other novels I've listed as books I've been reading recently, there's a lot less build-up, complexity, and payoff in this book regarding plot and characterization and stuff. It's very much, and then we went on this adventure. We went over here and we met these people, and we didn't like these people for these reasons, and they turned out to be true because they were chaos worshippers. And I will say, as much as I've enjoyed this book, and as much as I want to read every book in the Gotrek and Felix series because of it, I think I'm going to stagger them out a bit, because I do see myself maybe burning out a little bit on the, I don't want to call it more simplistic writing, because that's negative to say, and I don't mean it in a negative way, but you know what I mean, comparatively to some of the other books I've read. But yeah, I loved the characters of Gotrek and Felix. Obviously, you've got most of this book from Felix's perspective. I've heard that most of the series is from Felix's perspective, and Gotrek, his inner thoughts kind of remain a mystery. But I love Gotrek so much, this kind of half-mad dwarf who's constantly referring to Felix as manling. I love that we get to spend time with Felix's thoughts as he kind of tries to understand Gotrek, and he kind of weighs the differences between them, either as people or as human and dwarf. I love the whole conceit behind Gotrek of, like, there's this mysterious crime in his past that he's got to go and seek out a heroic death to atone for. I love the dialogue between them whenever they have conversation. Honestly, there is one story within Trollslayer which mostly has Gotrek not be present in terms... Actually, there's two. But the one I'm thinking of is where he sustains a head wound and therefore is kind of struck dumb for the majority of the story, and the problem of the story is getting Gotrek back to his true self. I honestly found that to be one of the stories I enjoyed the least because of his absence from it. And the final story in this... It's not technically a collection, but the final story in this novel is kind of similar in that Gotrek mostly isn't present for it, and it was just fine. I think Gotrek really makes these stories. I don't know how I would feel about Felix being absent from these stories, because obviously the stories are told from Felix's point of view, so we can't have that. But I hear that's kind of what happens in Age of Sigmar, and I am also just fascinated at the prospect of following Gotrek into Age of Sigmar and seeing what that looks like, and seeing what that new world looks like through his eyes, and so on and so forth. As it stands, the Gotrek and Felix novels come heavily recommended to beginners to the Warhammer Fantasy universe because, and I can already see this, it is basically a tour of that world through the eyes of Gotrek and Felix. It's kind of, I don't know if it necessarily intends to be, but it's kind of an introduction to the wider world. You get to see the followers of Slaanesh and, oh god, who's the Blood for the Blood God guy? I'm gonna know all this off by heart within a year, I'm sure, but right now I'm still learning. But yeah, we get a sense of the different factions, like, especially within Trollslayer being, like, made up of these smaller stories, we get a kind of quick fire burst of, like, this is what the Slaanesh people do, this is what the goblins do. This kind of segues nicely into, I guess, a criticism I do have of the book, and that's kind of unavoidable by nature of this being a bit more pulpy, and of course it was written in 1999 as well, which isn't all the way back in the mists of time, but is falling back further and further, as is the nature of time. And that's just that a lot of fantasy tropes are here for better and for worse, including, depicting true good and true evil. And I know there's a lot of arguments about, I believe it was D&D, which started to stray away from the notion of evil races, like if you are an orc you are outright evil, etc. But I think it can be problematic to just be like, oh, there's these bestial people and all the bestial people are inherently evil. It can come across wrong in a modern age, I think. I don't necessarily know if it does come across wrong in Trollslayer, though. And just to be clear, this is definitely just a criticism that comes from a modern reading of an older story. I don't necessarily think there was any ill intent in writing it that way in 1999. There are also a lot of damsels in distress in this novel, so I was relieved when Justine showed up and reminded us all that women can be powerful too. I think the story with Justine in it, by the way, is easily my favourite of the bunch within Trollslayer. It was so cool. One final thing that I would be remiss to omit. I read this book via the audiobook on Audible, read by Jonathan Keeble, who is incredible, to the point where I actually rated this book 4 out of 5 for the story, but 5 out of 5 for the performance. I think one of the reasons I like Gotrek so much is because of his performance, and he performs every character differently and brilliantly. But when I was looking into whether I might want to read these books despite being warned off of them, I did listen to the Audible preview of this book, and honestly it's probably this guy's narration which is what sold me on reading it ultimately. Here's a very brief sample.
"The drivers were unmanly cowards," Gotrek grumbled. "They refused to meet me hand to hand. I would not have minded being spitted on steel, but being blasted with buckshot is no death for a Trollslayer."
I just love the way Gotrek talks, like, "Come on, Madling, let's go." I love a grumpy dwarf, I guess. There are moments, especially coming from dialogue between Gotrek and Felix in this book, which are just outright funny, and I never think I want funny in a book. I never think I want a comedic book, but I do tend to appreciate it when I'm in the moment. Anyway, that's gonna do it for me. I think that's everything I wanted to info dump on you about my thoughts on this book. Ultimately, not really a lot of spoilers, because I'm not really reacting to a lot of the things that happened in the plot. I'm reacting to the kind of fact that this book exists, I feel like. I do want to read all of the Gotrek and Felix novels and then use my kind of knowledge of that world to springboard myself into reading a lot of the Warhammer Chronicles. Like, I know there's a trilogy based around the rise of Sigmar and stuff like that. There's a whole bunch of omnibus books which are thankfully packaged into affordable ebooks that I'm really curious to go and check out because they're all quite highly reviewed. And again, like, I don't know how much value I will personally get out of them as someone who does not play the war game, does not collect the miniatures and stuff, but you know, we're gonna see, I think, if one can become a fan of the Warhammer Fantasy Universe and then later Age of Sigmar, and also, by the way, 40k, purely by being a reader of the novels. It is something which I have been told is a bad idea, but damn it, who am I to listen to good advice? That being said, I don't want to burn out by reading too many of these at once, so I am going to put aside Skaven Slayer for the moment while I start on my reread of Mistborn. So thank you very much for coming and listening to what this Warhammer noob had to say about Gotrek and Felix Book 1. Let me know what you thought down in the comments below, as well as any recommendations, honestly, of Warhammer novels you would recommend, or ways for someone to get into the hobby outside of the war games and the miniatures that I haven't thought of. Apologies, do you call them miniatures? I don't even know that much. I am truly just willing to learn. Ultimately, I would love to be pointed to just like a world book, a lore book, a great big tome. I'm thinking Encyclopedia Eorzea or World of Warcraft Chronicle, that kind of a book, which is just about telling me the lore of the world with some nice art. I know some exist, I just don't know what would be good for me. I'm guessing, based on the fact that the Warhammer Chronicles books quickly sell out and they don't replace them, that the Black Library isn't so good about this kind of thing, that it might be too late for me to be able to pick up a book like that in the Warhammer fantasy fashion, but I would be interested in picking up an Age of Sigmar one and learning that world. But yeah, thanks for checking it out, and I will catch you in whatever I make next.